In his shorter work, The Enchiridion, Epictetus doesn't have an awful lot to say specifically about anger, but much of what he does have to say could be applied to anger just as it can be applied to any other emotional response or impulse that we encounter, and the ways in which we become engaged with external impressions, with things that are outside of our control. All of those can apply to anger. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at his much longer and more detailed work, the Discourses, that the Enchiridion is actually just a set of excerpts from, where Epictetus actually does have quite a bit to say about the emotion, about the judgments, about the habits that are involved with anger. So I'm going to only focus on those passages coming from about, 5 or 6 different chapters from the Enchiridion, where he's actually discussing anger in a way that informs us about what the Stoic attitude, what the Stoic take on that ought to be, and how we can actually start to free ourselves from being chained to anger, being subject to it, which is part of the Stoic good life, not having to endure anger, not having to be caught up within that passion, is really integral to living as a Stoic. In chapter 15 of book 1 of the Discourses, Epictetus is addressing a young man who comes to him with a problem. And this is a very common sort of issue that arises. We can generalize it by saying, what can I do when other people are angry or get angry and then won't reconcile with me? In this case, it's the young man's brother, and he says, what can I do about this? My brother's angry with me. I don't want him angry with me. And Epictetus actually has to give him an answer that, runs along these sorts of lines, because this guy's asking, what can philosophy do for me about these people who are getting angry with me? And the answer is not an awful lot. At least not about them. Philosophy can't actually affect how they behave. All philosophy can do is help you to adapt yourself to the circumstances that you're in. It may in fact be the case that your brother won't reconcile with you. It may in fact be the case that other people too easily and irrationally become angry with you. As a matter of fact, if you're doing the right thing, you probably can count on that happening. So the emphasis here should be, what can philosophy do for me, but not asking about them. Epictetus actually says to him, bring your brother to me, I can talk to him, but I can't help you change who he is or how he feels. This about them is outside of my control. It's outside of your control. The only person's control it actually lies in is your brother or your boss or your spouse or whoever it is that you're getting upset with you. So he says, what does philosophy actually profess to do? In every situation, it can help keep, and here instead of saying moral purpose, proiresis, he says ruling principle, to hegenomikon, but they're really the same thing, in accordance with nature. Philosophy can do that for you, and it can do that for you. It can also do that for somebody else, but the way in which philosophy engages you cannot do that for somebody else. So he says, the man who was consulting him said, what I want to know is this then, even if my brother refuses to be reconciled with me, how can I then do this? How can I be in accord with nature? And Epictetus is going to give him a bit of advice that we'll see repeated over and over again in the discourse, and we're going to take up in some of the other chapters. Nothing great comes into being all at once. And he says, let the tree blossom first, then put forth its fruit, and finally let the fruit ripen. He's using the metaphor of a fig tree. Although the fruit of a fig tree is not brought to perfection all at once in a single hour, do you want to try to secure the fruit of man's mind in so short a while and so easily? Don't expect that. So the idea there is, how can you deal with anger that you're encountering Well, you have to, in some respect, accommodate yourself to a universe in which people will, in fact, get angry with you and won't reconcile with you. That lies out of your control. You can bring them to Epictetus. You can give them a Stoic handbook or some other sort of techniques or philosophical perspective, but you have no control over what they're going to do with it. In chapter 18 of book 1, Epictetus talks about a kind of experience that we all probably go through at one point or another, dealing with people who make us angry. And in this case, he's talking about people stealing things or people breaking things, people harming you, but we could extend it to a whole range of behaviors. People do things that vex us. And we ought to ask about why that bothers us so much. Why are we angry with screw-ups, or we could pick all sorts of other terms if we want, with people who don't seem to get it. They don't understand that their actions are actually harming other people, or they do it even though they know that it's the wrong thing to do. So the question for us is not just, are we angry with them? Well, very often we do get angry. Should we get angry with them? It's not a guaranteed response. It's possible for us not to be angry, or if we do get angry, to deal with that anger very quickly. Not to hold on to it, not to allow it to turn into hatred. Misos in Greek. So we have to ask ourselves some questions, Epictetus thinks, in this section. We have to ask ourselves, why do these people do the wrong things? Now, one available option would be, well, because they're bad people. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. Bad people do bad things. Thieves are the kind of people who are going to steal things. That's what it means to be a thief. Epictetus doesn't think that's actually the right way to look at things. He wants to know what's going on in their mentality, in their motivation, that leads them to do the wrong thing, that leads them to harm other people, that leads them to be selfish and greedy and foolish. Well, it's this. They actually have screwed up understandings of matters of good and evil, right and wrong. Their moral compass is damaged, you could say, or never fully developed into something that could provide any sort of useful guidance. So, if we look at it that way, then we're posed with another question. How should we respond? And from a Stoic perspective, the answer to that is not going to be with anger. So if we're asking, what should our response, what is the right response for us, he actually says pity. The Greek word for that is eleos. And, in these sort of texts, it's usually translated as pity, but eleos could be also translated as compassion, could be translated as empathy, could be translated as doing good for them, extending something to them. We speak of certain professions as involved in that. Now, why pity? Doesn't that sound like we're then, being condescending? That doesn't actually have that sense for the ancient Greeks. It's a response to somebody else's suffering. So, to go back here, these people who are screwed up and are causing other people to suffer, who are doing the wrong thing, we look at them and we say, they're actually suffering, they've got things wrong, and not only are they screwing up in matters that are externals, property or our bodies, they're screwed up inside of themselves. It must suck to live like them and not be able to be happy except when they're, stealing something that belongs to somebody else and perhaps then incurring all sorts of consequences because of it, or not being able to be happy for more than a moment without putting somebody else down. That's a pretty miserable way to exist. And even if they enjoy some momentary times or intervals even of pleasure, that can get taken away from them very quickly. And they're stuck dealing with other screw-ups like themselves. That's the kind of people that want to hang around with them. And those screw-ups are probably going to make their lives miserable as well. So pity, according to Epictetus, really is the proper response. It's not looking down on them, it's a reaching out to them in many respects. We should go further than that, though, he says. We should ask, well, why do we get angry instead of feeling pity, when pity or even affection would be the natural reaction to them? Well, in part because we actually don't have our moral purpose, our proeresis, in accordance with nature yet. It's a sign that we are ourselves mistaken in how we look at things. We can say that we're Stoics, but the real test of it is when somebody steals your stuff, do you lose it and start getting angry with them and saying we should lock them up and I want to beat them up or things like that? Those people are jerks. Or do you feel pity for them instead? That's the real test. So Epictetus actually gives an example himself here. He says, I keep an iron lamp by the side of my household gods. These are little statues. And on hearing a noise at the window, I ran down and I found the lamp had been stolen. Very common thing to happen in ancient Greece and Rome. I reflected that the man who stole it was moved by no unreasonable motive. What then? Tomorrow I say you're going to find one of earthenware. He didn't take anything from me that really damaged who I am. So if somebody steals our car, it means we can't get to work, and that's got some problems with it, but it doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. If somebody steals our laptop, well, there could be a lot of consequences of that depending on what you've got on your laptop. But again, it's not the end of the world, and it doesn't affect the inner you, the inner person, the proeresis, the moral choice, the faculty of deciding how we want to respond to things. So, should we be angry with screw-ups? No. And not just because it's not good for them, but because it's not good for ourselves. Chapter 28 of Book 1 also has to do explicitly with whether we should feel anger or not. And in it, Epictetus is really trying to steer us towards the notion that when things are going wrong, both with other people and with ourselves, it's because we've lost a sense of proper measure, as he calls it. Or in our own parlance, we might say the person's lost a sense of perspective, they have their priorities screwed up. And what is that about? That's about what matters and what doesn't matter, or how much things matter, the larger and the smaller. So he talks a lot about tragedies in this, and we'll talk a little bit about a few of those. Tragedies almost always involve somebody not just having some fatal flaw, you might have heard that in theories of tragedy, but in Epictetus' view, people losing perspective, losing sight of how things ought to go, and they may get something right, but then they get other things wrong. And that produces this whole tragic getting things wrong across the board. What are they getting wrong? How important, how great or small? Let's call this the category of importance or value. And what are they being motivated by? Here Epictetus talks about sense impressions, or we can call these external impressions, the fantasia that the Stoics said, you don't want to trust these. These can mislead you. So tragedies result because somebody has some external impression and they go with it. They say, yeah, this makes sense. I need to react in this way. So Medea, he's got the example there. Medea is a classic tragic figure in Greek plays. Euripides writes an entire drama about her. Medea is a woman from Colchis who helps Jason steal the golden fleece, which means she becomes a traitor to her own people. She goes to Greece with Jason in Argos, marries him, has children by him. She's still a resident alien, so to speak, which meant something back then for Greek city-states. And now Jason says, I'm going to marry somebody else instead because that will, give me a good political prospects. He's going to marry the daughter of the local king. Medea goes nuts. And she ends up, among other things, killing her own children and then flying off, because she's also a sorceress, flying off in a dragon, in a chariot pulled by dragons. And she leaves Jason there his life in ruins, his prospects destroyed. And why does she do this? She's motivated by rage. Rage against being treated unjustly. And Epictetus talks about spectators going to this play, and we could think of all sorts of other things. This would be sort of like, watching Lifetime dramas, right? Or some of the other particularly emotion-driven scripts that cable channels like to put on. People watch this and they get riled up about it. And he says, what is wrong with you? I mean, first of all, she's a fictional character, but let's say she's actually real. Why wouldn't you feel pity for her? She's so lost, any sort of sense of what's right and wrong, what's proper perspective, what's, big and what's little in this parlance, that she kills her own children. And you're getting angry with her as a result. You're not as badly off as she is, but you're pretty close. So Epictetus says, when we understand that people are in fact carried away by sense impressions, and these can be, formed rightly if the person, has got their head on straight, or they can be formed very wrongly. Whoever remembers this will not be enraged at anybody. They will not be angry with anyone. They'll not revile. They'll not complain about other people. They won't blame or hate or take offense. Instead, their reaction is going to be one of compassion, one of feeling sorry for that person, for having their perspective, their priorities about what's actually important so deranged, so screwed up. And so he says, he's giving examples from Greek tragedy and Greek epics. He says, what happens quite often is big matters get driven by little matters. And that's because people don't really understand how to properly evaluate these. So we want to pay close attention. We want to come to situations already having a good sense of what matters more and what matters less, what perhaps doesn't even matter at all, so that we won't lose our temper, so we won't become angry, so we won't be carried away by the slew of sense impressions that are coming at us. In chapter 2 of book 9, Epictetus is talking about animals, and he's talking about the human animal in particular. How we're different from the other kinds of animals that he talks about is in possessing rationality. And that means possessing a free will, being a different kind of creature, being a different kind of animal than the other ones. And we can damage that. We can lose that, he cautions here. We can descend to the level of two other classes of animals, and anger fits in here in some important ways. But first I want to dwell on this. He talks about us having proiresis, or having the faculty of choice, the ruling faculty, and what that is to be rational. And we're never completely rational. This is a struggle on our part to attain more and more rationality by use of that very faculty to slowly purify ourselves. We're going to talk about these three elements and why they matter in just a moment. When we fail to do that, what we're doing is allowing this thing that's most distinctive in us to become more and more damaged, and eventually to be eroded, perhaps, and disappear altogether. And there's two different ways that we can go with this. He says we can be like the tame animals, like sheep, for example. And this is one particular way of being a slave to our own desires. Desires, he says, acting for the sake of the belly. So, for food and drink, or for the genitals, sexual desire. Those who are led by those are like domestic animals, and they're not like human beings. They're damaging that which is most human in them, to be acting in random or in disgusting ways, as he says. I'm not so worried about that part. I'm more interested in this discussion over here about wild beasts. To be theriotes, like a therion, a wild animal. And he says that when we act pugnaciously, injuriously, angrily, rudely, we're acting like a wild beast. So like a lion or like a wolf, something along those lines. And the actual words that he's using here, machimos, pugnaciously, machimos, the people who like to fight with each other. It can be translated contentious, the kind of people who are always getting into arguments, who can't, take a joke, who can't shrug something off. That's being machimos. Injuriously, hurting other people, blabaros in Greek, to be the kind of person who perhaps is insensitive to how they're harming other people, who just doesn't care, or who sees that as a good thing. Angrily, the word here is actually thumikos, the person who allows their spirit to be riled up too easily. And then finally, ostikos, rudely, in a way that's not appropriate. It's not taking into account other people's feelings or social mores. This is a person who really is like a wild animal. And insofar as we do this, we can become, as he says, bigger or smaller wild animals, but they're all wild animals. And in giving into that, we're allowing what's distinctively human in ourselves to be effaced. So if we allow anger to master us, we're actually allowing ourselves to be pulled into a purely animal way of existence. Now, what helps us with that? He says it's important to have learning. We need to learn how to understand ourselves, how to distinguish between higher and lower. All that's great. You can find that in books. You can get that through lectures. More important than that, though, is practice, actually doing things. And then to consolidate that, training, ascesis. He says, it's sort of like thinking along the lines of, here we go, what is... to store away bread and wine in a pantry is one thing, to eat them is another. So storing away the bread is like learning, and then practice is the actual eating. Ascesis, or training, is digesting them. What is eaten is digested, distributed, becomes sinews, flesh, bones, blood, and eventually becomes part of who we are. And he's got a great caution in here. He says, this is why the philosophers admonish us not to be satisfied with merely learning, but add practice and training. For in the course of years, we've acquired the habit of doing the opposite of what we learn, and we have in use opinions which are the opposite of the correct ones. So we get rid of those incorrect opinions that we get, but then we actually have to follow through on that. And he's got a great example here of the sort of thing that happens. Who is there among us that cannot give a philosophical discourse about good and evil? We can all do that. What happens if somebody interrupts us in the middle of it? He says, somebody interrupts us by an unusually loud noise, someone laughs at us, we get upset. So where, you philosopher, are the things you were talking about? What's going on with that? If we allow ourselves to become angry, we're giving in to something that's going to descend us to the level of wild beasts. What we have to do first is learn how to understand anger, how it arises, why it's not good for us, why we want to get away from it. Then we have to actually do things differently. And we have to go beyond just doing the right thing in particular circumstances and engage in some training. What nowadays we call anger management. That's what Epictetus is counseling here. In chapter 18 of book 2, Epictetus is trying to drive home to us just how strong the force of habit, as I put it here, the catchphrase that we often use, actually is, how much it matters. And he counsels with respect to anger that you engage in a kind of practice once you start making progress. He says, if you don't wish to be hot-tempered, don't feed your habit. Set before it nothing on which it can grow. So that's the first thing that you need to do. As the very first step after that, keep quiet and count the days on which you've not been angry. I used to be angry every day, after that every other day, then every third, then every fourth day. And then he says, if you go as much as 30 days without a fit of anger, sacrifice to God. Now, that would be pretty incredible. I mean, I think about my own experience, going 30 days without ever losing your temper, without giving in to this common human impulse. That would be quite extraordinary. Imagine putting that into work and actually thinking, how long has it been? It's sort of like those signs, how long has it been since we had an accident at this firm? You could do a sort of chart like that for yourself. How long since I said an unkind word to somebody? How long since I got frustrated, impatient, irritated? How long since I've been driving and I didn't like the drivers in front of me? That would be part of Stoic practice with respect to anger. Now, why is that so important? Because it involves attentiveness to this function of habit. Habit is how we connect past, present, and future together. It's what the proeresis, the ruling, the faculty, the moral faculty of choice, the character that you have, that's what its building blocks are habits that are interlocking with each other. So he says, when you get or stay angry, that has consequences that go beyond the immediate moment, because what you're doing is you're actually strengthening the habit. And that's going to make it tougher for you the next time around. Many of us, by the time that we come to Stoic philosophy, already have a whole bunch of bad habits. I know for myself, one of the reasons why I got interested in the Stoics is precisely because of having bad habits with respect to anger, already being in a sort of weakened condition. And that's the way that Epictetus talks about it. You're strengthening the habit, but you're weakening yourself. He says, we can actually change our ruling principle, the fabric of our character, by our acts and choices and the habits that result from those. So if we choose good habits, we're strengthening ourselves. We're actually becoming more free by doing so. If we choose bad habits, if we're giving into them, it becomes more difficult to resist them and to not give into them the next time around, and the next time, and the next time. So they're sort of self-perpetuating. He has this metaphor that's really quite brilliant in this. He says that if you give in to anger and you do it over and over again, you're leaving, like with any other passion, marks and wheels, as it's translated here, whip marks upon your soul. You're lashing yourself, you're allowing the things out there to harm you. Now, the way that habit works, he says, is after a while you start to accumulate what we might call psychological scar tissue. And if you've ever had any scars in real life, you know that scar tissue is often not as flexible and not as good as the other tissue in your body. So that after a while, what's going to happen is the next time around that you get whipped, it doesn't just produce a mark, it produces a wound, because you're no longer able to deal with it. Anger works like that. The more that you give in to anger, the worse off you become the next time around that you have to deal with anger. And this works this way not just in sort of the abstract, but it works that way with particulars as well. If you're angry with a particular person and you don't deal with it well and you don't reconcile, you don't eventually let it go, the next time around that they do something to you, you've got those old scars already in place and they're ready to open up and become, bleeding wounds when that person eventually offends you. So it becomes very important to try to take bad habits and reduce them and then replace them with good habits, habits that are opposed to them. In the case of anger, this would be things like learning how to be empathetic and see the other person's position, learning how to let go, learning how to forgive, and also learning how to maintain a proper perspective about how important it is for you to feel that way or to say the things that you say.